Hi, everybody, and welcome to another TLC conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about GDPR and its impact on testing. We have three awesome panelists, all first-time panelists for the TLC. Let me introduce you. Number one, we have Niamh. Niamh is currently working on digital transformation projects with FTI Consulting. She specializes in clickstream digital analytics and cloud warehouses, but she's also an experienced programmer, digital analytics manager, and I know her from her time at Dell as an optimization program manager. She's also a volunteer solution architect with the Irish Red Cross. And I know, Niamh, you didn't provide this information, but I was so excited about the work that you did to help build out Refugee B&B that I just threw that in there. Hopefully we'll get a chance to let you kind of describe what that is, because it's a pretty cool thing. Second up, we have Andrew. He leads the marketing and analytics optimization team at Fisher Investments, but he's got a long history in the industry. Before Fisher Investments, he was the head of marketing and analytics and operations team at Sephora, and he led Adobe's Global Center of Excellence for Web Analytics and Online Testing. Before Adobe, he led the e-commerce analytics and optimization organization for HP Direct. So he's got a long history. He's been in the business for a while. And then we have Eric Hansen. He's the founder and CTO of SiteSpect. He resides on the board of directors. He leads the overall product technology strategy for the company and is responsible for entry into the emerging markets. He has been involved in CRO and experimentation, personalization, all that jazz about as long as I have, since 2004. So back when there weren't a lot of tools out there to help us do what we do today. So I can't imagine how you ended up building one. And he, as most of you probably know, works with a lot of the world's leading consumer brands in the United States and the EU through SiteSpect. So welcome, panel. Niamh, Andrew, Eric, I really appreciate you guys being here. And I look forward to the conversation. So let's get kicked off. Let's start with our high-level question around the impact, the philosophical impact of GDPR. And here specifically what we want to talk about, the questions that have come my way is, why did GDPR come about? What were the problems or the issues or the concerns that the EU recognized, and how are these laws supposed to address it? And since we're talking on the test and learn community, I really want you guys to kind of think about the philosophical impacts of this on things related to testing, maybe personalization, segmentation, whatever. And I'll start with you, Niamh.
Pleasure. Thanks very much, Kelly.
Sure.
I can maybe refer to the Refugee B&B project and answer it as a whole, because I think it illustrates the sensitivity of some data. So Refugee B&B is kind of Airbnb for refugees, but we've given it to the Irish Red Cross now. So you'll find it on www.redcross.ie/pledge. We have the Irish Red Cross have obviously social workers and that kind of thing that kind of administer this scheme for us. One aspect of that is pledgers' information. Somebody might be considered a sympathizer, let's say, and that's sensitive information. But beyond that, we do actually hold refugees' information as well, and that's extremely sensitive information. So, I kind of, I would have genuine concerns about who would end up holding this information. If it's the Irish Red Cross, fair enough. But if they were to give that, let's say, to the Irish government, and then that became part of somebody's asylum claim, and could the refugees speak as freely? Could they speak maybe about criminal records or some health issues, etc.? So something like GDPR that says, when you give us information, you have to tell us exactly what you're going to do with it, where it's going to be stored, who's going to have access to it, and who you're going to share it with. That just makes my life much easier now, and I feel much better getting a kind of a information from refugees without having to worry about how could this be turned against them in some way. So we need to be like always mindful of what we build and mindful of what data we collect. And I know it's going to cause us a lot of headaches in the short term. We're going to have less traffic to test with. Our tests are going to have to run for longer. We won't be able to run as many tests. We're going to be limited in how much we can fully automate decisions. But really, I would like to advocate for, whether it's GDPR or other regulation, I think it's absolutely necessary. I think the end game for the kind of the Wild West of the first 20 years of the internet, as much fun as it's been, I think our time is up there, and I think that's probably a good thing. I look forward to helping as an industry to educate the public so that we hopefully can have more and more people opt in, and a more trusting environment around what's done with data.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Andrew, I'm assuming in the investment sector that you also have sensitive data. It's not quite as sensitive as refugees' personal information or medical data, but obviously there's a lot going on there, yeah?
Yeah, and Fisher Investments, I haven't worked at other financial companies, but from my understanding, we are probably even more conservative with our customer and prospect data than some other financial services companies. So it's created a lot more work. Absolutely true. I agree with the with the comment about, yeah, it creates more work, but I think it's all in the interest of more empowerment for the users and more transparency. So I think it's a good thing, even though in the short term it's got us pulling our hair out, more gray hairs. Just to kind of put things into perspective, previous to GDPR, we had implicit opt-in policy in the EU for Fisher Investments. So you came to the site. By using the site, you implicitly opt into tracking. There was a period of time for about a month and a half or so where, unfortunately, we had a fat finger error where that turned into an explicit opt-in into a couple of different countries. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think Belgium was one. And so this set up a natural experiment, meaning that it was unintended, but it did create a test and control environment where you had the other EU countries continue to be implicit, and you had the explicit for Belgium and the other country. And so my team used that as a proxy to kind of understand what GDPR might be like. And it turned out that we saw a huge decrease in the visibility of what we could track, and in also the lead submissions that came after that. It was like 70 to 80% drop off from where we were before. The one other thing that I'll say is that when you compare the US to the EU, US, we don't have any implicit opt-in. I'm talking pre-GDPR. In the EU, we did. So, for example, from the UI clicks, so from like Facebook or Google, impressions, clicks to then sessions, we've got to drop off like, maybe 80% from clicks to sessions. Whereas in the EU, because of the implicit opt-in that we had, it was like, I think like 40%, 50%, hovering around there. So already you had that. We had this natural experiment that happened. And now that we've got GDPR, it's, obviously made everything much more tangible, and that's where all the optimization comes in.
Well, let's talk about that optimization for a second. Eric, I assume as the CTO of SiteSpec that you guys have had lots of challenges around making SiteSpec GDPR ready so that you could do testing and that you still would have the volumes that you needed. How did you guys approach that with your clients?
Yeah, right. So, we come at it from the perspective of being a processor of data as opposed to a controller. I think Niamh and Andrew are more in the controller category, given that they're working with the brand. I
think, I'm sorry to jump in. I think it would be worthwhile to the audience if you defined what processor and controller is.
Sure. So I'll give you a non-textbook definition. So the controller is essentially the entity which is directly responsible for interfacing with the end user. Now, that's generally going to be a brand in our customer base, which comprises of many folks in e-commerce and retail. Obviously, that's where the consumer is going to. That's the URL of the website that they're interacting with.
It's the company that owns the data, right?
That's well, not necessarily owns the data, but is responsible for getting. Well, that's right. But they are responsible for getting the opt-in for EU citizens to collect and potentially store and act on that data. Now, the processor would be, for example, in SiteSpec's case, we're a tool or a platform that's used by that controller that also does data collection. And of course, in our case, we do A/B and multivariate testing, personalization, that sort of stuff. But there may be many other processors that are involved, and this could be other analytics tools. They could be fulfillment systems, marketing or remarketing or retargeting systems, et cetera, et cetera. So, so the role, I guess, from enforcement of GDPR, from a consumer standpoint, is the different things that that EU citizens now have rights, by law, to require of the controller. They can go to the controller or the brand and say, hey, I'd like to see what data you have about me. I'd like an opportunity to potentially collect or correct, rather, that data. And I would also potentially, as an end user or as a citizen, elect my right for you to delete the data, any and all data that you have about me as an individual. So that really goes directly to the controller. The controller then can work with their processors to fulfill those requests. And in fact, there are stipulations whereby if the citizen feels that they are not getting compliance around their request to manage, correct, or delete their data, then they actually can go directly through an arbitration process. They can go directly to the processors themselves. So, so as a technology provider, that puts us in, sort of an interesting position where we have multiple hats. And, if you look at our website, we actually have 3 different policies. We have a policy for end users coming to our site directly. We have a policy that explains to our own customers how we support their compliance and the ability for them to provide records of identifiable information about their end users that we would then go and purge. And then lastly, there's a policy that explains how those end users can essentially escalate directly to us if they feel they're not getting the compliance or the follow through directly from the controller.
Have these requirements, no, it did, but have these requirements and restrictions altered the type of personalization specifically or segmentation that you were able to do? Because obviously, pre-GDPR, it was okay if it was an artificial intelligence or machine learning type thing, and we didn't really know why we were delivering content A to person B. Post-GDPR, we have to be able to answer that question, right?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's insofar as the data that we collect and store. So, the jury is out, I mean, literally on some of these items about what is considered PII, personal information. In our case, we're storing anonymized data, so we don't store any PII. That being said, going into this process and working with our own customers, it turns out that things that you or I might not consider PII, certain EU courts have ruled that when combined, they could be used to identify an individual or at least narrow down who that individual might be in a larger group. For example, IP address. So, these days, I'm not sure who considers IP address unique to an individual, because generally they are rotated or they're shared across, corporate environments or whatever. But an EU court actually ruled that if you take an IP address and you combine it with a user agent, in other words, the type of browser and version and all that, that actually can be considered PII. So in SiteSpec's case, we actually did create a feature that our own customers can enable, which will still allow on the fly like geolocation of an end user based on their IP address, but then we don't actually store that address. So there are some trade-offs that we have to make, and at last count, I think the majority of our EU customer base have turned on that feature. So it still allows them to do targeting. It does not allow them to do after-the-fact segmentation based on IP address.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What other impacts have you guys seen on we'll say the controller side? So Niamh and Andrew, how has GDPR impacted your abilities to test or segment or, create personalized experience?
I think for me, it's not so much that GDPR in itself says you can't do something. Mm-hmm. There's very little in there, it just means you have to tell people what it is that you're going to do. And you need to have, I think fundamentally it's 8 rights. The people have the right to deletion, and they have the right to, where a decision is made about them by a robot automatically, they have a right to have a person review that decision. I think that it's more at this point in time anyway, I mean, as Eric said, we really have to wait and see. The EU or pull somebody up in front of a court once they're finished with Mark Zuckerberg and other matters. But no, we'll just have to see what cases do become. It's very not prescriptive, and I think we're just going to have to try to be transparent with people as regards what it is that we are doing. I think it's an interesting conversation, the conversation around what is PII. Even something like a timestamp on a transaction, if it's my data if it's one of my customers and I have this data in SiteSpec that includes a transaction with a timestamp on it, then I can obviously in my own database link that back to an individual, even if in SiteSpec it never existed at, so that there's a lot of gray areas there. So yeah, there's
going to be an impact. There's
going to be an impact, and we're just kind of waiting to see. I think that will probably be one of the larger platforms that kind of gets called up first. I think that it will probably be on the more straightforward, somebody leaking data or sharing of data. I think it's common practice. I think credit card companies do it. I think ad agencies have access to a very interesting selection of data that would be questionable. I don't think
arguably we have too much data today. We're collecting too much data. It's like, when we first got the ability to do behavioral tracking on websites, we're like, oh, we want to track every single interaction. And maybe not all that data is necessary. So maybe if we approach GDPR, just like we do with test pipelines, so you've got a pipeline of ideas, not all the ideas are good. Not all the data is necessary. So let's prioritize. And
I mean, there is the concept of data minimization in GDPR, and it kind of goes against everything. Like, I'm always like, oh, we must have all of the data, and we don't know what we'll use it for, but the robots might figure out in 3
maybe
years.
Instead of big data, we want medium data.
Small data.
Small data. Important data. Well, Andrew, I didn't mean to cut you off. You were going to say something.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to pick up on impact. So there's the immediate impact. So I didn't mention that Fisher Investments is a B2C lead gen, which is a little bit unique in that we're targeting consumers, but we're trying to get leads for the sales force to call. So there's like the impact to metrics, given that you've got the potential now to opt out, that we can't get your information to be able to contact you. So there's an immediate business impact of the quantity of leads that we could generate from the traffic that we have. So there's that immediate
impact. An impact to quality as well, because if they explicitly opt in and then give you a lead, it's a higher quality lead.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I can't quantify that for the audience. We haven't done a lot of analytics on that yet. So things are still preliminary. But yes, absolutely. But then there's other impacts as well. Like, for example, Eric was talking about all the new processes and procedures that he had to implement at SiteSpec to be able to act as a processor. So if there's any requests that come, that they can act on that data. So imagine that we're dealing not only with our testing platform, but we've also got an analytics platform. We've got all these other, I have a CRM platform, all these other SaaS systems, and Google and Facebook as well for our ads. We've got all these different processors that are acting on our behalf, and they've implemented different processes to take out that data. But as a brand, we've got to pull all of that together, and on top of that, then we've got to, work through all of our internal systems to be able to pull out that data as well. So that has created that. And to do that at scale, is really, really difficult. So that's a huge, huge project that we've got. And then one other, aspect of impact is, for example, no offense, Eric, but we're using Optimizely, and we have both the web experimentation client-side product and the full-stack server-side product. And with the server-side product, you've got a couple of different pieces of code. You've got a get variation function that buckets you. You've got an activate function that puts you into the right, experience. And then you've got a track function that tracks you. So in thinking about GDPR, these different snippets of code, to Eric's point about PII, are they in the right spot based on the explicit opt-in that we've gotten? So, for example, we've had to move some of those pieces of code given those GDPR requirements. So, like at that level of impact as well.
Yeah. Which makes sense. And actually, Tim has asked a really relevant question to that in the Slack, and I want to get to it, but before we do, Tim, I also want to get to a comment that Niamh has made in our shared document over here, because it's, before I go into how can we use testing to impact our opt-ins, I really want, Niamh, if you could describe for them the potential solution we talked about regarding data categories, and as opposed to specific, micro data opt-in.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of optimizing that opt-in capability, I mean, those that opt in immediately, great. We'll present them with a very simplistic experience. So a little bit of gradual disclosure. And then for those that choose not to opt in initially, let's maybe try to break down different data categories for them. I've seen a few different examples. Celebris break it down into essential browsing only kind of data versus a personalized experience. There's also maybe even...
So it's like you say, no, don't track me, or whatever, I'm not opting in. And then you say, great, we understand, here are your options. You want a totally generic experience, click here. Or maybe you're, X kind of person or X kind of, so it's kind of like a filter. It's like self-filtering and saying, you know what, I do want a little bit of a personalized experience. I don't want you to keep my data and target me later and sell it and blah, blah, blah. But show me this stuff for Nintendo, fans. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and I think that some people are just fussy about certain things. Like, I'd be fussy about location. I don't want people knowing, you know what I mean? I would want my location data being tracked. Apps do that very commonly, even when sometimes you're not even using them. So I would opt out a lot of the time purely because I'd be afraid of the location thing. Whereas if I had the option to kind of self-select a little bit at a more granular level, now I know I'm not your general user, but I think we need to try to think to a future where, I mean, like kids go up and treat a TV like an iPad these days. You know, I think we're going to have to think to a future where we're just going to be dealing with a different kind of individual and a different level of knowledge, and rightly so. Now, do I see myself going on a website by website basis and checking these boxes? That could be a bit annoying. So I was thinking maybe there could be some cloud solution.
So for
where,
all the entrepreneurs on the phone, we need a cloud-based, I own my data solution where I say, here are the things I'm opting into. And when I go visit a website, I want you to send that information to people so that I don't have to do it. We need that. And it has to apply with GDPR rules and everything going before. I know that there are some technology people out there. Let's make it happen.
Yeah, love it.
And then Tim,
as long as they don't sell the data.
As long as they don't sell the data. Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, the idea would be that you own the data, and maybe even by signing up for it, they pay you because then, you know, it is your data.
There will be no more selling of data.
That's right. That's right.
I've seen that exact business model tried and failed, but this was years before
GDPR.
So maybe this is that thing. These ideas, startups sort of come and go in cycles, and maybe the time wasn't right. So maybe it is now. We'll have to see.
And we have two comments here. One is that's what Sergio is trying to do with Privacy Cloud, and isn't that the idea behind OneTrust? And then Tim says there's some class of tools that OneTrust falls under. And then Tim asked a really interesting question, Niamh, with the idea of them saying, no, you can't, and then you giving them the second stage, okay, what kind of personalized experience would you like? At that stage, if they've already opted out overall, how can we do the second stage? I mean, would it almost have to be reversed, or as part of that original opt-in?
I think, I mean, surely there's some way we could do it with accordions. I'm not fully sure on the legalities there. I mean, it's funny even already to get emails to ask you, can you opt into emails? You know, there's obviously some inherent contradictions in a lot of this stuff. So I would certainly have to go and get the particular advice.
Maybe if they check do not track, maybe that doesn't get submitted immediately until the accordion comes open and they have to select some other stuff. It would be interesting to see the legality of it.
Yeah, I think you could do something there. Like opt-in.
Yeah.
And then more info, and in the more info, and we put the opt-out in there, something along those lines.
Maybe a little tricky. We'll see.
Yeah, I've got an interesting story about that. So we have a subsidiary in the Germanic countries, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, called GFI, and they had been using a double opt-in because the German laws are even more stringent than what the EU laws were. Yep. The double opt-in meaning you opt in and then you get an email and then you have to click on that again. And as part of all the testing that we were doing, one of the things that came up was, well, let's test what we're doing in the rest of the EU countries in Germany. And it turned out that, you know, when all is said and done, we felt as though we could comply with the German laws, with the GDPR laws, but use what we had implemented for GDPR in the EU in Germany as a replacement for the double opt-in that we had, and we actually got an increase in lead flow. So that was one of the bright spots that came out of all the work that we did.
And that leads directly into Tim's question, which is how can we use experimentation to increase opt-ins?
Right.
Well, I can start off with a... Yeah, I can start off with a couple of things. So we probably went through about 6 or 7 rounds of testing before May 25th, the deadline hit, and we had to kind of, you know, go with quote unquote the current winner that we've got. So we didn't have a lot of time. We get a lot of traffic, but we also get a lot of fall off in our traffic. So when you net it out into success events, it actually becomes pretty small data. So in terms of getting to stat sig, it was always a real challenge for us. So a lot of our calls were more on the directional side than on the scientific side, sadly. But for example, one of the things that we started off was just placement. So we had to comply with the, you know, EU laws. We had an opt-in for us being able to contact you. So you gave us your lead information, and then, we had a checkbox, okay, we can contact you afterward. So now with the additional GDPR, where do we put that? Do we put the GDPR before, at the same point, or after? So we went through a bunch of testing associated with that. I can talk a little bit about results. I can't get into too many numbers, or would you just rather me tell you about the different variations of tests that we did?
Up to you. Whatever you think people would find more interesting.
So in terms of the placement, what we found was that if you do it before, you're kind of asking for permission twice, which gets onerous, so there was a big drop off. If you do it for after, kind of the same thing happens. So it's better to just rip off the Band-Aid and get everything done at the same time. So we decided what looked best was to do it at the same time. And so then we went through some iterations on, do we have separate questions for both of those things? And if so, do we have a yes, no? What we found is if you give people the option of saying yes or no, a lot of people will say no. So then we went through another round of testing where we said, only yes. And, clearly that increased the lead rate.
So it's like a checkbox, yes, or leave it blank. Okay.
Or leave it blank. Yeah. Kind of take it or leave it kind of thing. And
so it's still an opt-in, but you didn't give them a chance to say no. They just had to not check it.
Right. Yeah. They would just have to. Yeah. So we did that as well. And then we use some iconography. So like safety, seals and that kind of thing. There's also how you put all the language in place. Like, do you put it all up front? Do you put a link into it so that people could link to it? So there's, the way I would think of it is that this is another conversion. It may not be your primary success event, but it is
arguably it's more important, because if you don't have it, you can't give them an optimized experience.
Yeah. So all the concepts apply.
Yeah. Very interesting. Niamh, Eric, what experiences do you have with it?
I'm not actually proactively managing an optimization program at the moment, so I don't really know.
So none.
But I can imagine, language placement icons, as I described, the gradual disclosure, the education element. That's probably what I have to add there.
Eric, have any of your customers done some of these?
So, yeah, I mean, in the EU, and I think Andrew pointed this out already, but, many sites have already had opt-in for some time. And I think the inflection point with GDPR has been less about, we have to put a new opt-in message on, or we have to figure out, what the most efficient way to do that is. And it's more about the back office stuff of, okay, what if we get these requests to delete data? How do we, mechanize that so we're not overloaded, et cetera? So yeah, most of what I've seen in terms of EU operators has been, taking what they already had. I think I've seen, one noteworthy case of a customer that has experimented with different placement. They tweaked their language a little bit in terms of the masthead that everyone sees, and more often than not, as an end user, what you get is, if you continue to browse our site, we assume it's okay, with you that we're collecting your data. And if you don't like this, you can view our privacy policy, or you can leave, kind of a thing. Kind of back to that same theme of how this actually plays out in terms of any, enforcement by the EU, as well as, any litigation that may occur, and subsequent, even revisions. I mean, we're going to see GDPR, v1.1 at some point. How that plays out, I think, just remains to be seen. Our customers are taking this really seriously. Again, that's more from a compliance standpoint and less about, making sure that they've got the, sort of the most persuasive way to get people to opt in. I haven't seen a lot of creativity, honestly, with respect to, trying to make a policy more palatable, thinking that will encourage more people to opt in. I think just there's sort of a church and state thing going on there with the
Yeah.
the policies and some of the disclosure language around it. That's not something that is subject to, sort of persuasive copywriting, and maybe the UI elements of, do we put the banner at the top or the bottom? How much contrast does it have against the rest of the UI of our site, et cetera? I think that's fair game, but in terms of the actual copywriting, the language, I don't think that there's been a lot of latitude. We still see, honestly, a lot of confusion, less so on behalf of our EU customer base, but more so on non-EU, which are still technically supposed to comply, because this is not about, the most common thing that I've seen is the belief that it's just people who are geographically located in the EU. And the reality is, if you're an EU citizen, it doesn't matter where you are in the world.
It doesn't matter where you're visiting. Yeah, absolutely.
And, to sort of, maybe complicate the understanding that people have. I've even seen, blog posts from, prominent, sort of technology leaders or other vendors, not in our space, but in other spaces, that say, hey, if you, if you basically just geo-target anyone coming from the EU, and you only do your opt-in for those people, you should be good. And that's just not the case.
Yeah. We actually had a client request us to do just that, and we had to go back to them and say, hey, that's not going to cover you, and explain why. So I've seen it.
Yeah. There's been some, calls that I've been on with other, customers, really almost more in an advisory role. And just some of these basic things, I think are still, people are still getting educated on them. And one other point I'd make, which maybe a little bit tangentially, is just about how it's really playing out, over the last couple of weeks since this, May 25th, as I say, the date that will live in infamy. How many of these requests to opt out, or, data access or data correction, are people actually getting? And people meaning the controllers themselves. I was with a customer in the UK 2 weeks back, and we talked specifically about this, and they said, we were thinking that it's a travel website that gets a fairly large amount of traffic, and a lot of that is repeat traffic from people that are booking travel arrangements. And they said, going into this, we thought we'd get, kind of tens of requests per day, and the reality is it had been hundreds per day. So whether that's an initial spike that's going to subside after, the privacy yahoos get it out of the system, or whether this is a trend or it's going to increase, again, only time will tell. But I think that's, really where I've seen the activity on our customer base has been less about how do we nudge people in, and more about, oh my God, what happens if we get, this volume of requests, or how do we make sure that we're not subject to, what are really fairly stringent and severe penalties. Yeah.
So, but I do want to step back just 1 second, because you said, how do we nudge more people in? And that's not really what we're looking for here. It's more about education.
Right.
Is there any latitude within GDPR to educate before we ask them to opt in? Because there is a huge confusion in the world around what this data is for, and the fact that it truly is anonymized, and the fact that we're, if you click on this and we're going to show you more products similar to that's not the same thing as Facebook sharing your entire life history with anyone. That there's some differences here, and being able to educate people about that and the benefits for them and how they might use it, that seems like something that we should be able to do. But one other thought I had is, earlier we talked about maybe going from big data to small data, or maybe big data to important data. We could also think the opposite when you think about website optimization. So back in the day, before we had targeting and personalization, we were trying to optimize the experience for everyone that got to the website. right? We didn't have segmentation. I have clients today who are like, oh, we need to have a personalization program. And, so we need to go out there and we need to figure out all this segmentation and do this persona analysis. I'm like, great. Do you have a method in place to deliver a differentiated experience? Well, no. Then it doesn't matter. I don't care how different segments are responding to this experience if you're not going to deliver different experiences to those different segments. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to take a step back and say, hey, let's use the optimization programs and platforms and tests and all of this stuff that we're doing to improve the overall site experience for everyone. It's easier. It's a lot more data, and it gives you the opportunity to improve the experience even for the people who haven't opted in, because once you figure out what works for the people who do opt in, you implement it for everyone. And then everybody's getting the benefits of those improvements and overall improving your downward funnel, your lower funnel metrics, right? I mean, is that crazy?
I don't think that's crazy, but I think it's only certain categories of user experience that you apply that to. People that bought this also shop for that. You kind of have to knock that out completely, right?
Yep.
But maybe more the macro elements that are, to your point, upstream in a funnel. It certainly depends on the type of website or mobile site that it is. But yeah,
and
no, it is
business,
getting back to basics. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think one thing there is whether there would be an inherent bias in the group that opt out.
Yeah.
I mean, they certainly aren't sure.
And you can't do a segmentation analysis to figure out how they're different.
Yeah.
No, but it's a segment broadly called privacy zealots that you have to omit, right? I guess they omit themselves. You just don't have their data.
Arguably, if they're in that category, they're also, once again, like I mentioned to Andrew, they're maybe not your most qualified traffic anyway. Because if they're not willing to let you store your data, they're also probably not going to finish that order or ask for that lead or whatever. So,
or not yet.
Yeah, not yet, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm. There is another angle on that we spent some time on, which is you've already got a whole population within your prospect database, CRM database, of people that haven't explicitly, opted in. So we want to make sure that we were able to have the capability to remarket to these folks. So we sent out some emails asking them to, formally, opt into the policies that we've got. We had really, really crappy response rates, probably because everybody was getting emails at the same time.
Like 15 a day?
Yeah, right. So that was where we were trying to get at the your aggregate population and trying to get at both the people that probably have high propensity and low propensity. But we didn't get a lot back to be able to see what that looked like.
So where does that leave you within that prior customer history?
Not in a great spot. No. Yeah, it was very poor response rates, and I think this is one of the areas where, although it'd be interesting to hear your comments, Eric. Although there's GDPR has got some very specific language in place, there are. I mean, you do have to interpret it, and you have to interpret it for your business. Right. And so, one of the things that we had to decide on is, what is the retention history that we're going to have for our data, and what is the, when somebody opt in, then what is the time frame that we would feel that would be applicable to? So I think. I didn't read all the language myself, but I think that there's a little bit of interpretation that businesses have in those areas.
Interesting.
Yeah, we've had that's exactly correct. I actually don't recall that there's any stipulation about retention length for that's specific to GDPR, but we have had customers adopt policies internally that they're only going to retain data for a certain period of time, and then work with us through, whatever various features and capabilities to essentially set up an automation to roll off data after a certain period of time. And I think that's probably just a defensive posture that more and more businesses are taking. No one
back
expects
to that. You don't have to keep it all to make decisions. So let's only keep the important data for only the minimum amount of time.
It's that, and I think from a legal and sort of a security posture, it's just exposure, potential exposure. That the more data that you retain over years, the bigger the problem you're going to have if there's any sort of a breach. Breach notification is another part of GDPR. So maybe it's sort of been that dynamic that's had people sort of take a second look at, all right, well, why do we have 36 months worth of data for all users? Do we really need anything beyond 12 months? And we've actually seen 12 months be sort of the
I've seen that with our customers as well.
Yeah, a point in time, say any data that's more than 12 months old, we're probably not going to use it anyway, at least not in the aggregate analytics sense. Whatever insights we needed to draw, we've already, produced in reports or, rolled up data anyway. Obviously, if it's customer data, it's customer support data, I think, I don't want to get into, sort of healthcare and that sort of stuff, but there's other reasons to retain data. But generally, I think internet marketing and, user experience, customer experience personalization, I'm not really sure what the case is to retain it for much longer.
I guess it would depend on the renewal cycle of, your customer retention. So if you are in a scenario where, maybe somebody was signing up for a mortgage, a home mortgage, for example, or a home equity loan, and you wanted to be able to send them marketing because you knew that they were reaching the end of their payoff, that's definitely a scenario where you need more than a year's worth, at least for most home equity loans I know of. Maybe there's some that are only a year, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
So there are use cases, but from my perspective, if we think about our customers and that cycle and what makes sense, we really shouldn't be keeping it beyond that.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to say, we've been talking about downstream and on-site. One interesting tidbit that we found on the upstream, so on the display ads that actually drive to the site that get to the opt-in. So we had to actually change the copy on our display ads because of GDPR. And as a result, we had to retraffic. And when you retraffic on an algorithmic platform like Google or Facebook, the algorithm has to go through all the learning. So on top of the GDPR impact, we're also, unfortunately, our media is in this world of hurt right now where we're having to kind of go through a brand new learning curve as well. So that might not be something that people necessarily have thought about either. So it's really hard to kind of tease apart all the different effects of what GDPR has brought because, it affects the entire system, unfortunately.
Yeah.
No, that makes a ton of sense.
Anecdotally, I would say that I've heard of a lot of ad agencies not meeting their CPAs since GDPR. Really? So there's certainly some practices that are not being done that maybe were done in the past. So I think that may well be a good thing from a customer's perspective. One last thing I'd like to throw out there. It's a little bit Black Mirror, but I don't know if you've heard of the Sesame credit score in China. So this is a Chinese initiative where it's kind of a social credit score, and it's nearly like a credit rating. It wouldn't be a million miles from a credit rating. It can decide whether you can stay in a luxury hotel or whether you can run for office. And a lot of things that are just, not really making
high
for
context
a great
culture. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Black Mirror season 3, episode 1, but it's actually happening in real life, and I think that the efforts here with GDPR, I think, will restrain us from that future, and I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a very positive thing. Maybe we can avoid that. Well, we have about 5 more minutes, and I'm going to give you guys each a chance to share with us, the one thing that you are going to take away from this call, or your one last highlight or one last comment. But before we do that, I want to remind everybody that our next conversation is going to be on use cases and experimentation. My date went away, on July 13th. And I want to do this one a little bit differently, because I've had several people reach out with interest, and I can't let everybody, we can't have like a giant panel. So instead, what I'd like to do is, if you have a use case in experimentation that you would like to share, and it can be related to anything, any use case in experimentation. It can be actual tests you've run. It can be program design. It can be, an intake process or a prioritization process, but some kind of use case about your program that you would like the opportunity to share. I would like you to submit those use cases to me through email. I'll remind you of it in the email that comes out with this recording for today's call. But submit to me in email just a bullet point description. I'm talking 2 to 3 sentences, nothing major, about what the experiment is, or what the use case is that you would like to share. And I'm going to try to gather as many of those as I can, enough to fill an hour. And then we're just going to go through them, and I'll let everybody share, until we run out of time. And that way, everybody will get to learn from everyone. It'll be kind of like the old school TLC before we had the panel. And it'll just be this one time. We'll try it, see if that format works. And then as we have other topics that sort of lend themselves well to that format, we will give everybody an opportunity to speak up and be heard and share, because that's why we're here, is to teach and learn. So with that in mind, I'm going to come back to my panel, and if each of you would just give me one final thought or takeaway from today's call, and I'll start with you, Niamh.
Just thinking about what I was going to say. One thing I'm really looking forward to with seeing how all of this pans out, and I think it has been GDPR related. It's coming back to the automated decision making and the right to be reviewed by a human. And a lot of our robots these days, we don't really understand why they make the decisions they make. So I just thought I'd mention an interesting OpenAI project. You can see it at debate-gain.openai.com. So it's your typical AI project. AI problem is the picture of a cat or a dog, but you can actually watch the AI arguing with itself about whether it's a cat or a dog, and it's saying, no, it has pointy ears, it is a cat. No, it actually, it's a dog because it's floppy ears doing this. But I think it would be really interesting to start to get that level of understanding about, these the automated decision-making processes, with the view to then, maybe someday the personal interaction, it might not be the best approach. Maybe a robot is better at making a lot of decisions. There's no reason that the person making reviewing my asylum application would be better qualified than a computer, to be perfectly honest. Often they're not. So I think it would just be really interesting to see how GDPR and the automated decision making pans out. That I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome. And just so you know, Niamh, I don't know if you're in the TLC calls channel right now, but Tim has been adding links to all of the things you've referenced.
Oh,
so they're there, including a clip from Black Mirror. So there. Andrew.
Well, even though it's been a ton of work, the upside is that it has significantly accelerated our testing and optimization program within Fisher because we were forced to basically do it. So we had a certain pace that we were going at. We had a certain level of interest that we were going at. We had a certain level of sophistication when we reported out on the results that people had. And as a result of all the testing that we had to do in a very short amount of time frame, given the impact on the business, it just completely accelerated the adoption, the buy-in, the education, the sophistication level of the way that people viewed optimization within Fisher. So it's actually gotten us to a better point. I know a lot of times we struggle with getting the organizational buy-in. So, you know, people are definitely bought in now. So yeah, that's been one of the nice highlights from it.
Unexpected too. Eric, how about you?
I guess my parting words would be, you know, I think EU brands and controllers are probably pretty well up to speed, and they're already, you know, dealing with this already. But, you know, sooner or later, there will be other jurisdictions that are rolling out something comparable, or it may even be, you know, their own GDPR. I mean, similarly titled. Canada, you know, I know there have been, you know, various, you know, sort of progress in the U.S. towards this. There's certainly a lot of advocacy groups around it as well. And so I just think that the better people understand this, the more prepared they're going to be for what comes next. And just to remind people that, you know, if you're not an EU operator, but you deal with EU citizens, you are still on the hook for this. The enforcement is not necessarily there right now, but sooner or later, you know, Department of Commerce will have some agreement, as they have in the past, the Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield, to enforce this in U.S. Business entities on behalf of the EU. And I think for U.S. businesses, you know, there are a small, I mean, it's still only, you know, you could spend 5 minutes reading a cheat sheet on GDPR and pretty much educate yourself. And I think that's the biggest gap that I've seen with our own customer base in the U.S. is just, it's like they hear about it, there's a reaction to try to do something, kind of like swat it away. It's really not that complicated, but it's evolving. So just, you know, get educated and I think get prepared.
Stay abreast of the changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. You guys were a great panel, made a tedious topic interesting and fun. Appreciate all of you for being here, and to all the TLC, thank you guys. Don't forget to submit use case requests through the TLC Slack and use case ideas that you are willing to share with the group to my email. It's kelly.wortham@searchdiscovery.com. I will put all of that, including a link to our recording today, in the email that comes hopefully today, maybe tomorrow. But thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
I guess you get to have Friday first. You get to have Friday first, then have a great weekend.